Thank you, Honorable Stedroy Benjamin. I abide by the protocols already observed. Sorry. All right. So, I could not help noticing the glaring imbalance here. This is a David and Goliath situation, I would say. But you know, they come with their army of might and power. I come on behalf of the people, the ordinary people, in the name of justice. I find it quite ironic that here we are talking about the Caribbean Court of Justice, about justice, and injustice is being displayed right before us. If the intention is to be fair and to present both sides of the argument so there is balance, then the scales of justice are unjustly tilted in favor of the pro-CCJ faction. And it raises skepticism as to whether there was a genuine desire to be fair to both sides of the argument. This only serves to deepen our distrust of the government, where this referendum is concerned. And we question the motives of the government in seeking to have the referendum at this time. And while many who are pro the CCJ referendum may have noble motives, I suspect the government's motives are not so noble. There have been 16 cases involving the government since independence, 16 cases that went to the Privy Council. And of those cases, only 5 were ruled in favor of the government. My mind is telling me that the government's motive may be to increase their win rate, especially in light of the Barbuda land and airport saga, legal saga. It may be that the government feels it might stand a better chance of winning if they have CCJ as the apex court. But of course, that's all speculative. Just thinking aloud, but you may want to think about it too. Let me say here, I am not fundamentally opposed to the CCJ. I believe that we should, in due course, accede to the CCJ as our final appellate court. I believe it is the right and natural thing to do because, like you, I'm a proud woman, black woman who believes that it is another step in ridding ourselves of the vestiges of colonialism, another step to true independence. I have just as much pride and confidence in having our own competent judges as anyone else. And I like that it's independently funded, and I like the lower costs. So I agree to a great extent to all the arguments put forward by the proponents. But we are not ready yet. I say we are not ready yet because whilst the CCJ in its conception and its operation is good, the proponents are missing the crux of the matter. And the crux of the matter is the lack of integrity, the corruption, the political interference, and the inefficiency we see and experience in the lower courts, which is our reason for our lack of trust in the judicial system. And trust is a must, my friends. Now, this is not an indictment on the CCJ as a standalone entity. This is an indictment on the whole judicial system. And any apex court, whether it is the Privy Council or the CCJ, is a part of that judicial system. A chain is as good as its weakest link. And in this case, that weak link makes up for the greater part of the system. It's like putting a shiny new hurricane-resistant roof on an old broken-down house with no windows, no doors, holes in the walls, a poor, weak foundation. The people reside in the house, not on the roof. 99% of the people will never need to go on the roof. They will never need to go to the Privy Council or the CCJ. They use the main part of the house, which is the lower courts. And that needs to be fixed before they can consider it a good house, serving its intended purpose. I must respectfully disagree with you, most honorable judge, that it is two houses. It is not two houses. It is one house. It is a part of one judicial system, and that is how it is linked. You cannot extricate the apex court from the judicial system because one does not have the option to go straight to the apex court. We must go through the lower courts first. That's how it's relevant. If many of us had a choice, we would probably go straight to the Privy Council or the CCJ, as the case may be. We have to touch that part of the system first, and that is where we see the dirt of integrity. That's where we experience the corruption. Almost all of us, or we know someone who has had personal experiences with unscrupulous lawyers, or we know of cases where there have been unethical judges and lawyers who have perverted the course of justice. Now, this is not to say that we don't have lawyers and judges who operate at a high level of integrity. I believe we do, but my experience is that they're in the minority. We have lawyers taking money for representation from both complainant and defendant in the same case. Some take clients' money for their personal use, and the clients have to sue them for their money. Judges sitting on cases that integrity would dictate they recuse themselves from because of the closeness to either the defendants or the plaintiffs, as in the case of Justice Gerthel Tom, who, being a former Attorney General in the Labour Party administration up to 2004, she should have recused herself from sitting as an appeals judge in the 2009 election petition case, because the perception was that she could not be impartial. And you know what they say? Perception is reality. We have blatant conflict of interest situations, breaches of confidentiality, malicious prosecution, political prosecution, as in the case of D. Giselle Isaac, who has been waiting for her day in court for the last 3.5 years. Meanwhile, she has won a case all the way up to the Privy Council, and to date, the judgment has not been honored. If they show such contempt for the Privy Council judgments made up of unknown juries, do you think they will respect the judgments of the CCJ? After all, familiarity breeds contempt. Then when we look at the judgments handed down by the local and regional courts, which appear tainted with bias, the well-known Observer Radio case, the Eloy de Freitas case are typical examples. When we see magistrates setting onerous bail terms for persons accused of non-violent white-collar offenses, which we all know are politically motivated, and other persons accused of major offenses are given bail with less onerous terms. Take the dismissal of the human trafficking case against Cheryl Thompson yesterday. This very serious crime, given a deadline of only 7 months, when Serpent and D. Giselle Isaac were given 15 months by the same magistrate. And they wonder why we don't trust them to be fair and unbiased. Our history is replete with examples that undermine our confidence in the local and regional judiciary. And some of these are the same lawyers, magistrates, and judges that may eventually sit on the CCJ. It is said a good indicator of future behavior is past behavior. And you ask us to trust? Trust is a must. And we simply don't trust because of our experience with the judicial system at the lower level. And our decision has to be based on our experience. This is our reality, folks. This is our experience. And the man with the experience is never at the mercy of the man with the argument. You can make all the arguments you want for the CCJ and how good it is. People will vote based on their experience, and their experience is with the lower courts. The legal fraternity and the politicians are to blame for this lack of trust, and we have to hold them accountable. These are the same persons coming to us, asking us to vote for the CCJ. Really? Really? The masses don't trust politicians and lawyers. Anything they are promoting will always be met with extreme cynicism. I would like to suggest that it would better serve the cause if you have ordinary citizens who have no skin in the game, no ulterior motives to champion the cause. I wish also to recommend that some sort of disciplinary commission be set up to investigate credible allegations of abuse of power and corruption against lawyers, judges, magistrates at the lower levels and the appeals court level, and recommend disciplinary action. This should be made up of persons from NGOs such as the good governance groups like the Movement, religious community, civic society, the business community, the bar association, maybe a retired judge, and give this commission teeth to act. And if they don't act, there should be some penalty to the commission's members. If corrupt lawyers of the legal fraternity know that there are consequences to pay for misconduct, then they are less likely to engage in corrupt acts. That way, we should see members of the legal fraternity being disbarred, sanctioned, suspended, removed from the bench, and being made to face the full force of the law like any other Joe Blow. And then the process of restoring our trust will begin. We know it's not realistic to expect anti-corruption efforts to achieve complete elimination of all corrupt acts, because people will be people, we know that. But the goal should be a judicial system that at all levels adheres to the highest standards of independence, impartiality, integrity, accountability, and transparency. A judicial system that incorporates all these qualities minimizes opportunities for corruption, it exercises vigilance against the risk of corruption, and it responds decisively when corruption is detected. And we, as good citizens, we have a role to play too. We ought to hold them accountable by standing up, engaging in demonstrations, protest action, even civil disobedience if necessary, to show them that we are not okay with this culture of corruption or misconduct that undermines our trust in the judicial system. I hear the proponents talk about being free from political interference because it's insulated by the Independent Trust Fund. And this is good. I like that. But we see interference at the lower levels, as in the recent case of the US woman who the airport security found ammunition in her bag when she was departing. She was sentenced to 1 year in prison by the magistrate in accordance with the law. And the Attorney General, on the recommendation of the superintendent of the prison, released her after 1 day and allowed her to travel back to the US. I identified with one notable attorney, Nelline Rogers Murdoch's outrage when she wrote, "It is not the purview of the superintendent of the prison or the Minister of Legal Affairs to commute or quash sentences. This is the singular purview of the courts, no matter the circumstance." That this action was taken so casually is a serious slap in the face of the court and a very serious erosion of the court's jurisdiction. She went on that this situation has the potential to seriously and surely militate against getting the people of Antigua and Barbuda to accept that the country can govern its legal affairs appropriately without improper interference. Sadly, she says, this issue will negatively impact upon the call for the people of Antigua to accept that the CCJ is something good and useful and necessary for Antigua and Barbuda. I totally agree with her. And she's right. It did militate because a friend of mine who was very pro-CCJ, after this incident, she said, "Pearl, I cannot in good conscience vote for the CCJ. Not with this kind of interference. How do we trust the justice system when we have incidents like this?" And to add insult to injury, the same Attorney General is the one championing the cause for the CCJ. Really? Is he serious? Mr. Attorney General, you have no credibility. We must be able to trust the judicial system, which includes the lower courts, if we are to have confidence to move to the CCJ as our final appellate court. Dame Janice Pereira said at the opening of the new law year in 2016 that attempts at judicial interference are on the rise. She said that these attempts emanate from places and persons and by methods which you would least expect. Now, the argument might be made that the attempts, but those may be the attempts that were unsuccessful. What about those that were successful? You know what they say, for every rat you see, there are 50 you don't. The very fact that attempts could be made speaks to how these persons view the court, that they believe that they are susceptible to interference. My recommendation would be that an independent trust, just like the CCJ Trust Fund, be set up to fund the lower courts, including the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, recurrent operating expenses. In that trust should go the 20+ millions of dollars owed to the court by the OECS countries. The government should be required to raise a realistic amount that would fund all operating costs and provide training for all court personnel and for upgrades to the system. We again heard Chief Justice Pereira yesterday at the opening of the assizes in St. Kitts crying out for the governments to fund the courts and indicating that persons may not have access to justice because transcripts of court cases cannot be produced because of the outdated methods being used. She said, access to justice is not calibrated from the top down, but from the bottom up. The bottom up. The lower courts needs to be fixed before we can move to having the CCJ as our apex court. The cart was put before the horse. The same commitment and effort should have been applied to setting up a trust fund to fund the lower courts first, because you, most noble judge, would have come through the system. You know more than any of us that there is corruption, that there is interference, and there is inefficiency at the lower courts level due to adequate funding. And I hear you when you say that all these are happening at the lower level while the Privy Council is the apex court, and that the Privy Council does nothing to assist with helping to clean up the lower courts. While the CCJ has been assisting countries, even in Antigua, with training and upskilling of staff. But the funding for these are project-based. They came from outside sources like the 20 million Canadian from the Jurist Fund. These are project-based and geared to specific areas of need and will have a termination date. The lower courts need a trust fund to fund the day-to-day operations of the courts into perpetuity, just like the CCJ. The argument of the lower cost of CCJ, that is valid. I agree with that. The point being made that only wealthy persons can access the Privy Council is not the case. Eloy de Freitas is not a wealthy person. Fillmore Jarvis is not a wealthy person. They were appellants, and they're not wealthy. And they took matters to the Privy Council. Furthermore, this figure that they have thrown out there of 300,000 EC dollars, that is deliberately, grossly exaggerated. I asked Eloy de Freitas, what was the Privy Council cost to him? And he said less than 50,000 EC. Now, his case was a long time ago. D. Giselle's cost was roughly 150,000 EC. That's about half of the amount they've been throwing out there. What the proponents are telling us, what they're not telling us is that a large majority of the cost is the local attorney's fees. Unfortunately, I left it in my bag, but I have a fee printout that I got from an attorney in the UK as to the cost for the Privy Council. And when I calculated all the different fees associated with the cost of taking a case to the Privy Council, it totaled roughly £10,600 sterling for a junior counsel. QCs were almost double, but you don't need a QC. Justin Simon told us so. When I added the cost of the hotel, which range from about 60 pounds to about 284 pounds sterling. These were hotels in the area in the address, close to the Privy Council. And I used the low end of the cost. I added also the airfare, economy class. The costs, including incidentals, total approximately EC 48,000. Perhaps the local lawyers can be more benevolent and reduce their costs. Additionally, Lord Neuberger, head of the Privy Council, said in 2016, we are piloting a video link so that hearings can take place over the internet at a time that is convenient for the local jurisdiction. So costs would be significantly less. I heard the Honorable Justice Saunders say this morning, why should you trust people you don't know as opposed to your own? And questioning whether we were saying that our people were inherently dishonest. No, my dear sir. No, my Honorable Judge. We are not saying that at all. We would never say that, most upright judge. But the argument cannot be diminished that there is a lack of distance of the CCJ judges from the political directorate. All these judges and lawyers know each other and in some cases are related. What we are saying is that judges are humans. And whilst they know that they should rule according to the law, there's a certain amount of psychological pressure that may make them unable to resist the impulse to rule in favor of their bias. Give us the distant justice that the Privy Council offers. No familiar social, political ties to any person's access in the court. They know no one. They have no interest in seeing one party win over the other. They will apply the law without fear or favor. And we will be able to say, truly, justice is blind. That's why we trust the Privy Council, Lords, and trust is a must. The President of the CCJ is approved by a supermajority vote of heads of government of the participating countries on the recommendation of the Regional Judicial Legal Services Commission. So ultimately, the politicians have the last say, because if the person does not get a supermajority yes vote, the person cannot become president. This leaves some room for the president to feel somehow beholden to the politicians. I think that's a flaw in the system. And my recommendation would be that the same body, the RJLSC, that recommends should also appoint, and if needs be, signed off by the heads of government. I hear the proponents waxing lyrical about freeing ourselves from mental slavery. And let me say here, I am as mentally free and as patriotic and proud of my blackness as any of the proponents of the CCJ. And any dismissive arrogance and any attempt to denigrate me by my opponents, by the proponents of the CCJ, because I am not convinced that the CCJ is best for us at this time, will certainly not make me change my mind. But you know what? These are all just good-feeling arguments and nothing else. And as far as I'm concerned, they're overrated. Most Honorable Judge and my learned pro-CCJ friends, we are not adversaries in this. We are in this together. We want the same thing, to ultimately have the CCJ as our apex court. We just don't want it at the same time. So you ask, if not now, when? When we see good faith efforts made to address our issue with trust at the lower court level, when we see actions being taken to fix the system at the lower level, when we see the courts being adequately funded through a source independent of the governments, when we see the governments clearing their arrears to the courts, when we see the disciplinary commission really working and legal practitioners and the judiciary made to pay for the consequences of corruption, then we will be ready to move to the CCJ. So I implore you, most venerable judge, use your influence and powers of persuasion when you meet with the heads of government and convince them to do what is right and needed to fix the lower court system. The bargaining chip is now in the people's hands. We won't change if things don't change. So the powers that be need to do right by the masses. Then come back to us in a few years, and I promise you, Once I see good faith attempts made to change things, I would be the strongest advocate for the CCJ. I look forward to the day when we would have acceded to the CCJ as our final appellate court, and we can all feel happy and proud with our whole judicial system, and then we can all sing Kumbaya. That's what we all want. Until then, my vote is no. Thank you very much.